Well, if everything is going to hell in a handbasket, it's the exponentially growing information technologies that will save us in the form of G and R, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics. Robotics really meaning artificial intelligence. So I'd like to address criticisms. I do engage in a lot of debates and dialogues. I had a debate on a panel at the Woodstock Film Festival Friday night. This critic's main objection was, well, computers can't even do, and then he had a number of things to fill in the blank. Principally, can't tell the difference between a cat and a dog. Actually, they do pretty comparable things already, and we're building a dog-cat recognizer that I'll report on at the next Singularity Summit. A little hard to get funding for that, but I get tired of people saying that. In my 1999 book, Age of Spiritual Machines, I had this cartoon without the dotted lines, but I designed this cartoon to make the point that people will point to various tasks that a computer can't do as being forever emblematic of the difference between biological and machine intelligence. But one by one, these different claims fall by the wayside. I put dotted lines in, I reprinted this in Singularity's Near, which came out in 2005, put dotted lines around the ones we were working on, the collective we. And already only humans can drive cars has really fallen down. After the first DARPA challenge, people said, wow, but that was an artificial, it was a complicated 300-kilometer course, but it was artificial. They can't really drive in an urban situation. So then DARPA had its urban challenge, and that has been passed. But as long as there's anything still on the wall, people will point to that as a criticism. We're not yet at the point of Turing test-capable AI, where machines can deal with human language at human levels. They do a fairly good job on simpler tasks, certain natural language queries. Translators are not bad, but they're not up to human level. They're not literary quality. That's a Turing test-capable task. So we need to look to different arguments to make that case. And that's really the thrust of what I presented yesterday in terms of the hardware requirements, where we are making inexorable exponential progress, and we're also making progress on the software, and I'll come back to that. A particularly common criticism is just to express incredulity at the conclusions that come from exponential growth. Look at these projections, they're ridiculous and therefore they're wrong. A lot of those ridiculous predictions have come true, like a network that ties together billions of people around the world and so forth. The real crux of the issue here is the intuitive linear perspective versus the historically correct exponential perspective. And I very often are in debates where people say, oh yes, I accept exponential growth, but they don't really accept the profound implications of exponential growth. And it's not intuitive because the linear perspective is hardwired in our brains. The exponential perspective is really hard to get one's mental arms around. And even though I've been thinking about this for decades, I continue to find it daunting, and people sort of fall off the horse as you follow these exponential curves out. But as I said yesterday, 30 steps linearly is 30 steps exponentially is 1 billion. We've already seen that kind of progress. Say, compare my cell phone to the computer I use as a student, that's a 1 billion-fold increase in price performance. Another criticism is, well, Kurzweil just takes these exponentials and projects them out, and we know exponential growth can't go on forever. You have 2 rabbits in Australia, you get 4 rabbits, 18 rabbits, 16 rabbits, but finally that hits a wall when they eat up all the foliage. And basically exponential trends do run out of resources for a particular paradigm. But what happens in information technology, as we see the end of the line for a particular paradigm, it creates research pressure to create the next paradigm. And as I showed yesterday, Moore's law started decades before Gordon Moore was born. Moore's law, which is the shrinking of component sizes on an integrated circuit, was the fifth, not the first paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. There were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s. 1952, CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower with a vacuum tube-based computer. And every year they got smaller and smaller to keep this exponential growth going. That finally hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. I have in a little museum, a computer with tiny little vacuum tubes. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. It then jumped to the fourth paradigm, transistors, and then we've had several decades of Moore's law. And there have been regular predictions that that would come to an end. Gordon Moore originally said 2002. Justin Ratner now says 2022. He's the CTO of Intel. But he also reported at last year's Singularity Summit that they have the sixth paradigm, three-dimensional self-organizing molecular circuits working in the lab. They expect the crossover to be in the teen years, long before we get to the end of flat integrated circuits. And I analyze in chapter 3 of Singularity is Near what the ultimate limits of computing of that sixth paradigm, computing at the level of molecules, is. And there is a limit, but it's not very limiting. It would be trillions of times more powerful than the human brain, at least in terms of hardware capacity. A particularly important criticism was, well, okay, hardware is progressing exponentially, but software is stuck in the mud. And people don't really appreciate the progress that's being made in software. There are hundreds of applications now, as I reported yesterday, that are pervasive. People say, well, where's all the AI that was supposed to happen? Remind me of people that go into the rainforest and say, well, where are all the species that are supposed to be here? When there's 50 species of ants within 25 feet of them, but you don't see them. They're hidden in the ecostructure. And AI is all around us, but it's hidden. But every time you communicate intelligent algorithms with the information, every product involves AI in its design, its manufacturing, its control of inventory systems. AI is doing many different types of tasks, like diagnosing electrocardiograms and blood cell images, and I mentioned other applications yesterday. If all the AI in the world stopped tomorrow, you couldn't get money from your bank, communication, transportation would halt. That was not the case 15 years ago. Somebody yesterday mentioned that, well, we still have our hand on the plug, but we don't. Our whole civilization would grind to a halt if we pulled the plug. Fortunately, the AI programs aren't smart enough yet to organize such a conspiracy, but they are AI software doing tasks that used to require human intelligence is all around us. The narrowness of these narrow AI applications is gradually getting broader as we're understanding more about how the brain works. And as I mentioned, that's the principal goal of brain reverse engineering, to understand these basic principles, not just to not just to copy the brain without considering how it works. I don't actually think we could even do that. But the idea is to understand the basic principles and then leverage them the same way we leverage any scientific insight, like Bernoulli's principle. People tend to dismiss applications as soon as they work because they lose their mystery. If we don't understand how something works, it seems deeply mysterious. Just as was mentioned yesterday, genetics seemed incredibly mysterious until we understood the organizing principle, and then everything fell into place when the structure of DNA was discovered. And there's many different hints about how the brain works, but until we actually find those organizing principles, it seems very mysterious. But every time we develop a technique that actually works, it's dismissed as just a technique because now we understand its underlying methods. But actually some of these methods are so being applied to massive databases and massive amounts of computation, they do provide nonetheless surprising results. And in Singularity's Near, I report on some different measures of software complexity that are gearing up. And I mentioned also chess, that we can now actually get comparable results to Deep Blue or to Kasparov with a computer that just runs on a program that runs on personal computers, because we have improved the basic pattern recognition capability. And that is really the heart of what human beings do. If you ask what is the difference between Kasparov playing chess and Deep Blue is using massive power to do the combinatorial explosion of the minimax algorithm. A human player is looking at the board and applying pattern recognition. That is the strength of human intelligence. We recognize patterns. And we can actually see that now in the cerebral cortex, in that there's a basic pattern recognizer that's repeated billions of times and organized in hierarchies. And we're learning those secrets. And I mean, that's my field of pattern recognition. And there's still a gap, but that gap is shrinking between human and machine performance on different pattern recognition tasks. Another criticism is that software is basically unreliable. Jerome Lanier likes to ridicule the poor performance of software. His favorite target is Windows. But we have many examples of very robust software, particularly when we build them in decentralized ways, like the internet, where pieces of it can go down, but the information routes around it. It's very much the same paradigm that the brain uses. We can lose connections and neurons. We do that all the time. But the system still works because it's highly decentralized. There's no chief executive officer neuron in the brain. And the internet works in a similar way. Nobody's taken down even a portion of the internet for 1 second over the last 10 years. It is a very robust system. A very important criticism is the complexity of the brain. I had a recent debate with John Horgan, who wrote the main critical article in a recent issue about a year ago in Spectrum, IEEE Spectrum, saying it would take trillions of lines of code to create human-level intelligence or to simulate the human brain, and the human brain is equivalent to trillions of lines of code, and the most complex programs we have are only tens of millions of lines of code. That's actually ridiculous. Those lines of code don't exist anywhere. As I pointed out yesterday, there's only 50 million bytes of information in the genome, period. And that is the design of the brain and the body. Now, it's not conventional code. It's not C++. It's Fortran, I think, but it's written in codes for amino acid sequences to create proteins that organize in 3 dimensions, and it creates a structure that has a massive redundancy. The cerebellum has the same structure repeated billions of times. The same thing with the cerebral cortex, and there's actually, I would say, about equivalent of 1 million lines of code, and that's probably about what we will need. Based on the simulations that have been done already, you get the same results, which is interesting, that approaching this from the amount of information in the genome and then looking at actual simulations that have worked for portions of the brain, we come to the same conclusions. About maybe 25 million bytes, which is about 1 million lines of code, which is well below the most complex software systems that we have. We talked yesterday about quantum computing. There's no indication that there's quantum computing going on in the brain in terms of observing the brain to see if there's any quantum computing going on, and there's no indication that our performance requires quantum computing. We don't do the sorts of things very well that quantum computers would do, like factoring large numbers. John Searle's Chinese room is a very subtle argument, and I have a long discussion about that. There's actually 2 different levels to it. He talks about, the idea is you have this guy in a room and he's got a book. There's different versions of it, but the quintessential one is he has a rule book. He's asked a question in Chinese, and he looks up in the rule book and he follows these rules and he writes down little notes on pieces of paper, and finally he comes out with an answer, and the answer is convincing, and then Searle says, well, who has the understanding? Obviously this guy doesn't understand Chinese. But in this metaphorical system that Searle has set up, the guy is not the whole system. The guy basically is acting as a central processing unit, and there's equivalent of all the different parts of a computer. The little notes that he takes are the operating registers, the rule book is the stored program, And he's describing a computer, one that in fact would take millions of years to make an answer, but it does represent an interesting semantic device. The whole system does have an understanding of Chinese, because by definition, if it didn't, it wouldn't be answering questions. So on a performance level, that system is passing a Turing test in Chinese. It's exactly what it's doing. And it does obviously have an understanding of Chinese. And so computers can have an understanding of Chinese, at least in this ontological exercise that Searle presents. He then also talks about the consciousness question. Well, where's the consciousness? I mean, is the book conscious? Are the little pieces of notes conscious? It's actually a very good challenge. He's basically representing the challenge of how could software have consciousness, awareness of itself. It seems absurd, and when you think about the absurdity of that, that is Chalmers' hard question of consciousness. But as I mentioned yesterday, I took Searle's argument and replaced, every time he said manipulating symbols or something equivalent to that, replaced it with manipulating neurotransmitter levels and ion channel levels, and it read then as a very convincing argument that the human brain has no consciousness. And it again represents the mystery of where consciousness arises. There's also a challenge from, so those are some of the challenges on feasibility. There's also challenges on desirability. Bill McKibben wrote a book called Enough. He's a respected environmentalist, the first to write about global warming. In the book Enough, he says basically enough already with advanced technology. We've gotten a lot of benefits from it. It's been very good, but we don't need any more of it. And he talks about the dangers, which I agree with, and his recommendation to address these dangers in GNR is relinquishment. Bill Joy, in his cover story in Wired magazine, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, has been interpreted to be an advocate of relinquishment. He has a few sentences in there that sound like that, but he's very definitely not a proponent of relinquishment. He's now a venture capitalist with Kleiner Perkins, investing in green technology, and agrees with me that it is only these exponentially growing information technologies, like nanotechnology applied to solar panels, that can address these major challenges. There's three things wrong with relinquishment of these technologies. Number one, it would deprive us of these profound benefits, like reprogramming biology away from disease and aging. It would require a totalitarian system to implement. That was the message in the novel Brave New World, where technology was considered too dangerous, so the totalitarian government banned it. And thirdly, it wouldn't work. It would just drive these technologies underground, which is what happened in that novel, where the technologies would become even more dangerous because you wouldn't have the kinds of controls and ethical standards that you can implement in a freer system. And that's basically my own recommendation, and Bill Joy and I agree on that. Ethical standards for responsible practitioners, like the Asilomar guidelines for biotech, which have actually worked very well for 25 years. Over that period of time, the number of accidents in biotech that have caused harm have been zero. But we also need something more, which is a rapid response system to deal with intentional destruction, like, for example, a bioterrorist taking these same tools, which are much more widely available than, say, the tools and knowledge to create an atomic bomb, and could be potentially more dangerous because it's not necessarily local in its effects. At a routine bioengineering lab here in New York or anywhere else, you could take a benign biological virus, say a routine flu virus, and change it to be more deadly, more communicable, more stealthy, and so on. But we actually can do something about that, and we can set up a rapid response system. I'm on the Army Science Advisory Board, and the issue I'm working with them on is to set up a rapid response system using rapid genetic sequencing. Took us 5 years to sequence HIV. We can now sequence a virus in 1 or 2 days. We could create an RNA interference medication. So I don't have time to get into technical details, but we can, and at a high level, we need to put a high priority on creating these rapid response systems. We did that in software viruses. When software viruses first emerged, people predicted, well, these are going to become very sophisticated and ultimately destroy computer networks. The first part of that prediction came true. The second part did not, because we do have a technological immune system. And here Bill Joy and I criticized the US government for posting on the web, and it's still there, the genome for the 1918 flu virus, which is really a recipe for destruction. I think there's some particularly dangerous information that should be given to responsible practitioners who might need that information, let's say to protect against different types of dangerous flus, but to have some review that basically they're not terrorists. So, there's been a long tradition in science ever since Copernicus replaced Ptolemy that there's nothing special about humans, there's nothing special about the Earth. We're not descended from gods, we're descended from worms. But there is one way in which we're unique. We happen to evolve a hierarchical level of ability to think so that we can create elaborate structures and call that an idea and then use that idea, give it a symbol, and use it in another elaborate hierarchy of ideas and call that an idea, and we build up this whole hierarchical structure we call knowledge. We're the only species that does that. We've combined that with an opposable appendage so that we can change the world and extend who we are, and that's basically the role of these tools. So, on that note, let me take some questions. Thank you.
In the next maybe 10 years, 2010 to 2020, as someone that tends to believe that we're going to go through this sort of sharper, accelerating change, the knee of the curve, I think what's going to happen is there's going to be probably a greater acceptance of an idea that's basically, that you've spent a lot of your time defending and evangelizing. And I think it's going to be a bit of a shift. I'll call it like, in a microscopic term, like a Twitter-esque shift where it's dismissed, then it's made to be less than it is, and then it reaches a certain point and everyone's talking about it. And how do you think, I think the political systems and our ability as a society to grasp this is just, we're totally unprepared. And so I guess my question is, what do you think, do you agree that there's going to be this sort of shift that will come with, as this accelerating change increases, is there going to be this acceptance that just becomes mainstream, and are we ready?
There's a gradual increasing acceptance, but it's a big world out there. But, that's one of the roles of this conference and this other ways in which to communicate these ideas. And my own motivation is I think it's important for society to understand this perspective because, A, it provides the tools to address the major challenges of humanity, and it's really, in my view, these exponentially growing technologies that can do that, while at the same time we prepare for new challenges and new risks, and I think we have no choice but to face them, and there are ways of doing that, and those are the right issues for us to be focusing on.
I have a question about an event that took place 2 months ago with Larry Page and Nathan Myhrvold and Greg Venter and George Church on the rise of synthetic biology. My question is, what is the impact of synthetic biology on your views of the singularity?
Well, synthetic biology is part of this whole revolution of treating biology as a set of information processes, and we can change the substrate. Synthetic biology seeks to make small changes so that we can have DNA codes that don't exist naturally. We can create proteins that don't exist naturally in biology. Once we understand the basic mechanism by which biology expresses itself as information, there are other ideas, stem cells, the idea of turning genes on and off with RNA interference and gene therapy, and there's a whole long list of ideas, but it's very different than the old paradigm, which is just finding something that happens to work through basically drug discovery, which was really just a hit and miss process. And I think it's very exciting. It's one idea in the whole biotechnology track of information technology, and that is scaling up exponentially. And you can see it very smoothly when you look at, for example, the Genome Project I showed that curve yesterday. The same thing is true of the Connectome project, understanding the connections in the brain, and the proteomic project to understand how genes express themselves as protein, and so on.
A few speakers at this conference have argued that unless we take great care in developing an AI with the right kind of moral framework, it is very likely to become, in a short period of time, something that might pose a great existential threat to humanity. How seriously do you take this argument?
Well, I think we should take that very seriously. We have an existential threat already, which was introduced over half a century ago. There's still 20,000 thermonuclear weapons, and they're still on a hair trigger, and they make even less sense than they did during the Cold War. I'm glad to see that Obama is focusing on that, but that's something the world really should not forget. Biotechnology provides a new existential threat in that those technologies could be extremely dangerous. We don't yet have that rapid response system. Part of the problem in our ability to respond to threats is we don't do it until the threat actually manifests itself. So one might hope that there'll be some inoculation with some small event that will cause people to wake up. But there are people working on this. I've been involved in trying to set up a rapid response system for that. Unfriendly AI is perhaps the most daunting threat of all because intelligence is the most powerful phenomena in the world. And if you've got an entity that's twice as smart as you or 1,000,000 times smarter than you that has it in for you, that's not a good situation to be in. The only defense from that would be to get some AI on your side or make yourself smarter and have friendly AI that's even smarter. Unlike biotech, where we can talk about the Asilomar guidelines in a rapid response system, or nanotech, where there are similar guidelines for safety and ideas of setting up a nanotechnology immune system, i.e. technical solutions, there's no technical solution to this problem. There's no little code. Let's put this code in all our AIs and that will keep them friendly. I think the primary way to look at this, as I mentioned yesterday, is that these AIs are not a world apart. It's going to be integrated with us. I mean, it's already very close to us. It's on my belt. They'll eventually make their way in our bodies and brains. We will become the machines, first in part. And so it's going to be one continuum of a civilization. And the best way to ensure that the world civilization of 2030 or 2040 is friendly and reflects our values is to have it reflect our values today. Is that a guarantee? No. But if we were to become a totalitarian society, that'd be a pretty good bet that we would be that way in the future. So that's really a social and political level, which is to say that these issues do involve everyone, not just the engineers. I don't think we can rely on engineers to do this. They say that war is too important to leave to the generals, and the same thing is true for AI. One more question.
Similar, kind of related to his question. What would you say to people that won't even listen to your argument at all, that completely would say, and I don't think this audience at all would be any part of that, that technologies are, evil in some way and they're a complete threat to our survival? How do you handle that fear of change, the unknown, and I guess people that would see the singularity as like a doomsday or extinction event?
Well, there is a strong intellectual Luddite movement that has a certain appeal, but invariably people also appreciate technology. It's very hard to find people that don't use technology, and I think it's important to point out how much we've been helped by it. Human life expectancy was 37 in 1800. There was no understanding of the germ theory of disease, there was no sanitation, there was no antibiotics. Schubert and Mozart died in their 30s, and that was typical. It was 48 in 1900. You can read Thomas Hobbes as to how difficult life was. It was short, brutish, disaster-prone, disease-filled, poverty-filled for almost everyone in the world, only a few hundred years ago. So we have made a lot of progress, at least among some people. There's still a lot of suffering in the world. I'd also point out, some people say, wow, but these technologies are only going to be the province of the rich. And I say, yeah, like cell phones. of which 4 billion people out of 6 billion now have cell phones, and they're misnamed because they are really gateways to all human knowledge, and it is fostering a real cultural revolution in China, where half the farmers now have these knowledge gateways in their pocket. So I think that's the importance of communication, that people appreciate what technology can do, while acknowledging the dangers. This is not a utopian vision. Technology has been a double-edged sword ever since we had fire and stone tools. Well, thank you very much.